Welcome to the Contractor Success Forum. Today we're discussing the theory of constraints and overcoming supply chain issues. On the Contractor Success Forum, we discuss financial strategies for running a more profitable, successful construction business. I am Rob Williams with Iron Gate Entrepreneurial Support Systems. We have Stephen Brown with McDaniel Whitley Bonding and Insurance Agency. And we have Wade Carpenter with Carpenter and Company CPAs. So today, what is the theory of constraints? And how is that helping us with all these crazy supply chain issues that we're having these days?
Well, just to kind of introduce it, we did a podcast a couple months ago about the supply chain issues, and a construction trade organization heard it. And they asked me to come in and speak to their group in end of June here. And, I started thinking about all the issues that we had. Last time we focused on the costs, and obviously there's delays and things like that because people can't get materials. And some of that's still going on. There's probably a lot of that still going on. Some of the costs have stabilized, but people are still having issues trying to get their projects done. And we've had some things like I got a contractor out at the airport that can't get enough concrete. It's a $3 million job, and he can't get enough concrete to finish the job. He's having to do it 40 yards at a time. In developing this thing, I started thinking back to the theory of constraints actually came up in a book, or it was coined by Eli Goldratt back in 1984 in a book. It talks about the bottlenecks in a company. And a lot of it has to do with manufacturing, stuff like that. But part of what we want to talk about today is applying it to construction. And it's sometimes a little tough to make that leap. Rob actually hired Eli Goldratt back in well, you can tell me when it was, but when you had kind of a
Early 2000s.
manufacturing and cruise. So, Rob, you want to tell us anything about that experience with him?
It was great. We had them and we had a few other people, but Eli, we had all his tools. He had the Goldratt Institute. So we had classes that we could give our crews, and we had videos, and we had all kinds of materials. But going in there, they just taught us more and more about constantly how to identify that weakest link, that constraint that's holding up the factory. And that's all you really need to focus on. Not all, you're going to focus on everything, but that's what you're going to focus on. We wasted so much time improving areas that were not our weakest link, and they didn't speed us up. So identifying first and then focusing on improving that weakest link, it multiplies your improvement together. Their goal was usually, how can you be 10 times more whatever the measurement was? And that's impossible. We can't increase 10 times, but over about a year, you really could. It was amazing. I think the biggest thing was taking our time when we started this factory. It would take us like 2 months to get these designs until it was a house framed in the field. And we got it down to about 3 hours, not 3 hours to get it to the field, but 3 hours to get it into the factory. It was at least 10 times. That was probably 20 times faster, because you just keep working on identifying and then solving that constraint and improving that one thing that you focus on that's going to give you the most improvement.
So there's always a weakest link?
There is always a weakest link in there, Wade. Do you want to explain that?
I think what I've seen, and maybe you experienced, there's a difference between a controlled environment and manufacturing, which is usually what he focused on, and the chaos sometimes that is a construction job.
Yeah. Well, answering Stephen's question, there's always a weakest link, because as soon as you improve your biggest constraint, well, then there's another weakest link. If you have 100 links, you fix the weakest link. Well, the second weakest link is now your weakest link. Or maybe you created a new weakest link by whatever you just fixed. So yes, there's always a weakest link.
The point is, the objective here is not just to identify the weakest link and get rid of it, but it's to work around it.
Well, yeah, you could work around it. It's to improve that weakest link typically,
Okay.
but it could be working around it if you're stuck. Yes, that could be one way to improve it. But Kaizen is the thing. And in Japanese, that means constant improvement. So in the United States, a lot of people have coined the term kanai, which is constant, never ending improvement. So it never ends. You
Okay.
never become lean. You constantly improve.
Does that make sense, Stephen?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Tell me more.
Okay, well, like I said, let's kind of bring this back to the supply chain issue if we can. And I know we talk a lot on the podcast about people giving away margin for revenue. So if I was to give you a situation, and this is kind of like in reverse, but sometimes they will want a higher revenue job that has a lower gross profit. But let me give you a scenario, and you guys just don't overthink this, but let's say you have a choice. You're a small contractor, you have one crew, and you can choose one path or the other. So, first path is we could take this one job that's going to take 12 months to do. It's $1.2 million and it's a 20% gross margin. Or you can take a path of we're going to take $300,000 jobs that only make 17%, and it would take four of those to make a $1.2 million jobs. So, logically speaking, which one would you choose, guys?
I'd say the big job with the bigger margin. That's what logically it seems like to me.
That's what I would say.
We talk about the sweet spot, and sometimes we focus so much on the margin. And what Goldrat, I'm going to bring this back to the supply chain, but what Goldrat said was that what's the throughput? So, what if I was to tell you, assuming we could finish one a quarter or whatever, 13 weeks would be the equivalent of finishing that in 1 year. So, what if I was to tell you on the small job, the $300,000 job, what if we could finish it in 11 weeks and we could do one and roll back in? What would that do to your profit?
11 times 4, 44. Yeah, well, that would be a
Well,
lot faster. You'd make more money in that amount of time, then you'd still have some time. So, yeah, because if you only had a 15% difference in margin, 17 and 20, but you got 20 something percent difference in time. So, yeah, so that then I'd like those small jobs.
well, you have to do the math, but if you do the math in the scenario I gave you, you could actually make the same if we could turn these every 11 weeks. Now, if we went down to 10 weeks, we would actually make about 10.5% more gross profit, or we could take 5 weeks off during the year and make the same gross profit. If we bring that down to 9 weeks, then the profit goes up by almost 23%, and we could take almost 10 weeks off and make the same profit as that $1.2 million job. Does that
Yeah,
make sense, guys?
it does. That time off, that does remind me. That has something to do with like deer season, doesn't it? I think you used to have to do that in the winter in the slabs, and they're not getting anything done. They probably make more money by taking time off and going away for deer season because they don't get jack done in the field anyway with all the mud and everything else.
Well, I hope that kind of illustrates that time is money, but unfortunately, with the supply chain, they're pushing them out longer and trying to get the stuff, and everybody's going over time and trying to get the materials to finish. And we've talked about some things like completion penalties and things like that. But just to kind of bring that back to it, let me ask you guys another question, because I came out to Memphis not quite a year ago to see you guys, and Rob came and picked me up at the hotel from his office. So if I was to ask you, how long would it take to get from your office over to my hotel to come get me?
30, 40 minutes.
Okay. So it's interesting you gave me a range. So why did you say 30 to 40? You gave me a range.
Well, we had the 3 busiest intersections between my office and your hotel. So it could be either one of the best drives if it was Sunday, or it could be a horrible drive if you want me to pick you up at 5 o'clock.
Yeah,
Take a
Wade, don't
whole lot
stay there
longer.
anymore.
Yeah, what are you doing staying at that intersection? That's the busiest intersection in the
Call us
state.
first.
Okay. Well, I'll do that. But,
Yeah.
but if it was as opposed to rush hour traffic, what if it was Sunday morning you were coming over there?
15 minutes. I can get there in
15
15
minutes.
minutes.
Now, it's interesting you told me 15 minutes now, but originally you said 30 to 40.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
30, 40 minutes is the average, but yeah, that's not in the
probably an
morning.
average, but think about the fact that like your subcontractors, they build in a margin of safety because they say, well, how long is it going to take to do? Well, 7 weeks. Well, it could take, 4 weeks if they got in there, or if things go wrong, it could be 13 weeks or whatever. A lot of times we will build in a margin of safety And there is a buffer between, especially if we're a general contractor, we're waiting on other people. Gold Rat has a story in the Boy Scout hike where he's kind of relating where, they're trying to get from point A to point B before dark with 15 boys, and they start off and they get slowed down and whatever. And he's trying to keep everybody together because he's the only, chaperone there. And a couple of the boys are way ahead of everybody else. And then there's somebody gets behind. In his
Herbie.
story, a kid named Herbie. He's a big fat kid that he slowed everybody down. And there was a huge gap between these other boys and Herbie, and then everybody behind him couldn't get around Herbie. So that's where we have a gap between other people, and then they slow the other pieces of the puzzle down. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So they would all hurry up, and then they would have to wait for the slowest link over there, Herbie.
Right. Also in the story, he talks about like his son stopped to adjust his backpack. Even though he was one of the faster kids, he had something going on. Well, everybody behind him couldn't get around him. Well, he fixes his backpack and, catches up. But then everybody behind him is playing catch up. They have to run twice as fast. And that's what happens in construction, is that we have somebody waiting on something, whether it's weather or materials or inspector or whatever gets in the way. Then one gets behind, and then 1 week can be turned into 4 weeks by the time you're done with the project.
Yeah, I guess you got to fix that situation, right?
Right. But Gold Rat talks about the gaps between each boy in the story as a buffer. And you have a buffer between different pieces of the construction project, right?
Yep.
And so how are we going to manage that when we're constantly having issues with, we can't get the materials, we can't, any thoughts on that, guys?
I just had a customer of mine had a weakest link, turned out to be an employee that wasn't doing their job and didn't order the materials on time. It put a year project back 7 months before they found out what was going on. And then they had to get their hands on a lot of materials that were hard to get. They had to pay more money for them. They had to get a better quality grade than spec'd out in order to get the job done. And they kicked it, and they're in liquidated damages because of it. But at least the owner's happy, and they know they're getting the job done. And they're going to have the job punched out, finished first week of July. And that year projects run about 5 months over. But that weakest link was their employee, not just supplies.
I'm wondering if this project manager was getting punched out because
The project manager retired.
Yeah, right.
okay, that was
what
the nice way of doing it, huh?
What I just heard Steven say there is they found the weakest link, and that's kind of the big step. You're constantly finding that weakest link. It just took them too long to find it. So, yeah, be aware to always be looking for that weakest link. If they had,
Well, this had normally been a great project manager.
yeah.
So they just assumed they didn't need to look after him.
Yeah. So, identifying that, and what Wade was just saying in the story is identify that weakest link. So you identify that, and I don't know if you're going to take the Herbie story, a little further.
Well, I think we can leave that for another day, but there's a lot of things that, in today's world, if we're waiting on things, we need to be talking to our subs and our suppliers immediately. It's like, what's going to hold us up? What are we having trouble getting? And those kind of things. And, whether we buy it early or whatever, we can kind of get into that. But one of the things that we talk about all the time on this podcast in relation to Profit First is Parkinson's law. If you guys remember, Parkinson's law, it really applies to any resource, but originally it applied to the concept of time. So if we're given 2 months to do a job, we're going to get it done in 2 months typically. Or if we're given 2 weeks to get that job done, or 2 days, magically things get done. And we see it all the time on construction projects. Last minute, we're scrambling to do all these things, and everybody kills themselves at the end. But if you don't have that buffer in there, you're going to be constantly chasing your tail. So we can talk about that. But I think Parkinson's law is the fact that people are going to, if you give them so long to do a job, they're going to take that long. So just like your story about taking 30 to 40 minutes to get to my hotel, well, they possibly could get it done in 20 or 25 if they scheduled it right.
Yeah, in Parkinson's law, it's whatever time is there, they're gonna typically take it up. But then, squeeze that in there and see if they can do it and focus on that right link, making sure you're picking and identifying that right link to work on, and then seeing how you can shorten that time up. As you were talking, I was thinking about the typical reaction I would get from either our superintendent, some crews that said, "Oh man, I'm going to get everybody 5% faster, and this job's going to go 5% faster." I'm like, no, the numbers don't actually work up that way. It's still only going to be going faster as your weakest link, and then you're just going to have all this downtime in the other people. So work on those weakest links and get them maybe 10% faster, and you're going to be a lot better than improving everything equally across the board if they're not part of the schedule constraint that needs to be improved. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it does, and I think in that story about Herbie, the Boy Scout, and the hike, it was my understanding that this scoutmaster, Wade, you called him chaperone, but here in Memphis, we call them scoutmasters. But
Well, the
anyway,
scoutmaster abandoned him. He was out sick,
yeah,
so he got
Yeah.
stuck.
but no, I'm just messing with you. But anyway, what I'm saying is they had an objective to get to the campsite at a certain time, and they identified the weakest link, and turned out he had way too many supplies. They divided up in the backpack. They moved him to the front of the line, and just that little bit of tweak got the job done.
That's right. That's right. For so little bit of effort, I think in the story you can actually tell like tripled their speed. It's going to take, I'm making up this part, it's going to take 6 hours. Then they got there in 2 hours.
Yeah.
But just for that simple 5 minutes of rearranging things.
And the thing about construction is there's so many moving parts. And it's just really tough to make that leap sometimes. And you don't know where the things are. So can we spend the last few minutes talking about some of the things we possibly could do?
Yeah.
Because, Gold Rat, we focus on cost accounting. And he doesn't say we shouldn't be doing cost accounting, but he's saying we should use the cost accounting that we do to look at it in a different way. And he calls it throughput accounting. So that's a story for another day, and maybe we can do a whole episode on that. But what do we do about the supply chain? How do we speed it up? I've made the point about Parkinson's law. And one of his points in one of his other books is like a Gantt chart. We say this subcontractor is going to do this day. They work against us because we built in the safety and we're trying to catch up. How can we recapture some of that buffer? What he says is, well, especially if you got liquidated damage issues, maybe you go to your supplier and say, if you can get this done in 9 weeks instead of 12, then I'll give you another 2% profit. But also, as part of that, let's say, I don't know, the slab's got to get done, and then somebody's got to come in next to, masonry or whoever the next supplier.
Yeah. The
What if
frame.
the first person comes in and says, we're going to be done in 2 weeks. So we're going to tell the next one in line, they think they're going to be done in 2 weeks. And then 1 week we tell them, and then 2 days before, and just tell them, you want this extra profit, we're going to give you some heads up, but you got to get in there when we need you. But things like that can bring that buffer time down because they've probably got their people committed on something else. Does that
And
make sense?
identifying and again making sure that person, which in that case that was our bottleneck, was from the slab to the framing. That was one of our big bottlenecks. Yeah, you identify that is the part that needs to be fixed. If you can do that, and you were just saying about the supply, I had a guy 12 to 18 months of lead time for his material, and you just made me think about that. It's like, okay, was that really 12 to 18 months, or could he have FedExed it for something else and gotten it in 2 months? Who knows? But if that was his bottleneck, and was it really 12 to 18 months, or were they just telling him that to cover, like you said?
And isn't it interesting that nobody knows when the supply chain issue is going to loosen up? And this is what's going on right now with the construction industry. They can predict it and everything. But I read an article that just a lot of it depends on all the storage containers that are stacked up at the Los Angeles shipyard. And the ships are told, don't come in and drop your stuff off because we don't have space and room for you. there's
Yeah.
a lot going on there. So everybody's gonna you call and you order some pipe, they'll go, well, it's gonna be 6 to 9 months before I get it. Whoa, 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 no. They know they can't do business that way. The pipe suppliers. They got to give
Mhm.
you a more definitive answer than that. And then you call a sub and you say, I really need you. We got everything lined up. I'll give you a bonus if you can move up your work. And they
Right.
say, okay, I'll do it, or no, can't possibly do that. Then you got to figure out another angle of attack, right?
Right. Well, you brought up the next point, but if you got like all these subs behind you, and then go to either the suppliers or the suppliers to the subs and say, what are you having trouble with? Because exactly that point, I may have brought this up on the podcast before, but I had a multifamily contractor that was held up $900,000 final draw because they couldn't get this one fire protection, like, part that was specified. So they could not get the CO. Stuff like that that's sitting on. So right now, we really need to go and talk to all of our subs and our suppliers and say, where are we having trouble getting this stuff? Because they had no clue as to how long it was going to take to get these specific fire protection parts. That's another thing I would tell you immediately, that go do that if you're in the middle of a project. Make sure something's not going to hold you up.
Yeah. Yeah, because there are people, especially when originally the ships were stacking up there. I had one client, scaffolding manufacturer, or actually friend, and during that, I was really worried about him because his stuff's coming in from China, and he was stressed out. And then next time I talked to him, and he's like, "Oh no, we got it figured out. This guy's real engineer." Actually, I don't know what he did and how in the heck he got it when nothing was coming in over there, but he figured out a way to make it happen in just a couple of weeks, a lot faster. And it wasn't from doing that. So he knew that was his bottleneck, and he fixed it. And it doesn't really matter how he fixed it. It's that he knew that one thing was it, and he was aggressive, and he didn't take that for granted that was the answer and then just accept it. He found a way to make it happen when there were all these other people that are just stuck and said, "Oh, we can't do anything about it." Well, somebody's figuring it out. And that probably
Well,
makes the other people's even take longer. So be
yeah.
one of those guys that's figuring it out. Don't be the passive guy that's just sitting and putting his hands up.
That brings one more point, and I know we probably need to wrap up, and I'm not making all my points today, but time is money also for the owner. So, like in that multifamily, they could not rent out their apartments, or in the case of a developer or a home builder, whatever, they can't get any cash until they finish it. So there's money tied up at the bank. They've got money tied up in future income for these apartments. So we got to remember that. And in that case that I told you the story, the owner went back to the engineer, architect, I'm not sure, that specified this particular thing in the fire protection system, got them to change the specs, and then they went to the inspector, and there was stuff that was sitting on the shelf that they could use, and it was substantially the same. But just by talking to them, time is money for them too. And sometimes we got to think about, how do we shorten the chain? So I guess we're kind of out of time. I need to wrap up, but I hope this has made some sense to everybody. I'm loving the topic kind of as I'm developing. I'd love to
Oh
maybe
yeah, we
give
can do a
this,
few of these.
yeah, I'd love to give this talk again to any other trade organizations out there. I think it's a great, timely topic for your members. So
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, how would they? This is a quiz question here. If somebody is like interested in that, where would they go? How would they find out? Stephen, do you know where they would go to contact us? Or
Contractor Success Forum. We have web
.com? Or
.com.
yeah, go ahead.
.com, yeah. And it's
Or
Contractor Success Forum, not contractors. So
oh,
look
yeah,
it up that
I
way.
think we're on all the Apple and Spotify and all those
yeah. And
We're
is
so state
anybody
of the
on
art.
LinkedIn? Have y'all ever been on Yeah, LinkedIn. So where do they go for that? We've got a
We got a
forum, don't
LinkedIn
we?
homepage.
Yeah, we got the homepage and we've got a little discussion place there. So, yeah, Contractor Success Forum. Type it in LinkedIn. You find us, discussion, ask us questions. We should ask them some questions and maybe get some answers. Wade Carpenter, where would they go if they want to hire you for one of their trade associations to do a talk?
Just either contact me through the webpage there, or carpentercpas.com would be great.
All right, man. That would be a heck of a topic because I know everybody's got all these meetings right now and because hotels, everybody are coming back and they're meeting, they're having all these events. So that'd be a great resource for our listeners and their trade organizations to have Wade come speak about that. Oh, wait, by the way, who are we? Stephen Brown, McDaniel Whitley, Plumbing and Insurance Agency, Wade Carpenter, Carpenter and Company CPAs, and I am Rob Williams, Irongate Entrepreneurial Support Systems. So thanks, you guys, for listening to the Contractor Success Forum, and we'll see you at the next episode. Have a great day.